This is Hajra, and in this video I proudly present my watercolor and gouache techniques and effects motherlode. This video covers more watercolor and gouache effects than any other video on YouTube. I know, I checked. Let's get started. This video is crowded. First, there's the solid watercolor wash. It can be done on small or larger areas and on dry, as here, or wet paper. Pre-mix a large amount of color and lay it down quickly, following the wet edge down the paper for even color. The graded wash. Similar application as the last one, but this time add water to your paint gradually to get a smooth color gradation. Like the solid wash, I've demoed this on dry paper, or wet on dry, which means wet paint on dry paper. If the paper had been pre-wetted, it would have been a wet on wet application. Watercolor blooms. Anytime wet paint is adjacent to wetter paint, the uneven water tension causes bleeds that look like cauliflower blooms. Annoying when unwanted, blooms can be lovely textural effects when deliberate, like say for a splotchy cave wall or a rusty car. When desired, blooms can thus be provoked by dropping in water with a brush or with a water dropper. Dry on wet. Thicker paint over a wet water or paint wash will hold its shape. This can be done with a brush loaded with thick paint or with a watercolor pencil on wet paper. Wet on dry, which again is wet paint on dry paper, can also be used to create hard-edged paint sections with little or no blending. The effect will be impressionistic, graphic, or mosaic-like depending on how you use it. Wet on wet, one of the magically unique techniques of watercolor. Here, wet paint over a water wash or wet paint into another paint wash, which is called charging, will softly mingle and blend colors. Here I've charged two colors where I charge magenta paint into yellow paint. Notice how it makes a really cool red-orange blend. You can use as many colors as you want when you charge. With watercolor, you can leave a shape or area with a hard edge, as we did with tiles previously, or you can soften an edge with a clean, damp, not soaking brush, or you can soften an edge with another wet adjacent color and then water on a damp brush. You can even soften a dried hard edge with a damp nylon hair brush or a more aggressive scrubber brush. Glazing, another watercolor specialty. This is when transparent washes, which are dried in between layers, are put down, creating color mixes akin to stained glass layers where the colors sit on top of others. Remember me talking about grisaille in other videos? Well, that lovely process is really just a specialized glazing technique where the underwashes are in areas with darker values. Remember that an edge can be softened with another color and then water? The same can be done when glazing over other colors. When the underglaze's color is used to blend out an edge of an overlying glaze, it makes for richer transitions. Use a wet sponge to create a partial, lacy, water underwash, then paint over the area. Paint will be drawn to the wet areas, and the result can be used to start bushes or trees or sea foam or anything you can imagine with a lacy silhouette. When a loaded brush is pushed down on paper, then lifted with an angled swoop, the paint forms a darker belly area which tapers to a feathery tail. Also, note how stippling paint down is different from stroking paint down. The stippling yields even paint deposits, whereas the stroking, like the pushing paint down motion, yields less paint at the end of the stroke. Splattering. Paint can be spattered or splattered to create energetic specks, which can be stars, distant flowers, kicked up sand, or just fun color. Spattering can be done on bare paper or over color glazes, on dry paper or wet paper, in a fine mist, or in large drops, for various effects. Paint drip down on angled paper creates cool pouring effects. Use alone or over glazes and in one color and direction or many. More diverse dribbles can be achieved by blowing on wet paint with a straw. Multicolor loading. Dip the left and right side of various wider brushes in two or more colors to create multicolor effects in dry textured strokes or in wetter fluid strokes. Apply paint sparingly with your finger or press your fingerprints into drying paint for texture that can be used for foam, spray, tree knots, or moss on rocks. Cheesecloth and gauze. This netty cotton gives wavy, linear, cross-hatching textures when it's placed over or under wet paint. Remove the gauze when the paint has dried. Over wet, saturated paint, saran wrap can be added in a random, crinkly placement for unique abstract effects. Again, remove the plastic only once the paint is dry. Substances that yield unique textural effects when dropped into wet paint include rubbing alcohol, which creates white-rimmed circles and shapes, or salt, which creates bursting, starry, fireworky shapes. Bleach, not shown, can also be used to create washed-out splatters and shapes. All of these are corrosive to the archival state of watercolor paper, so they shouldn't be used for archival artwork that's meant to last. Lifting paint. Endless shapes can be lifted from wet or dry paint with a brush alone or with the help of a metal erasing shield or paper scrap. Not just for correcting mistakes, lifting can be used for highlights or other compositional additions. Wet paint lifting yields softer feathery edges, while dry paint lifting yields hard edges. Larger, more specific shapes can also be lifted from wet paint. Simply wrap a coin in a paper towel and lift lightly or more firmly for some cool moons or planets. Or wrap other flat-faced objects like binder clips in a paper towel and lift other shapes. shapes. And yes, tissue or paper towel can be used alone, wadded or rolled or crumpled to lift clouds, waves, fog, mist, and other soft shapes. And finally, a damp piece of Mr. Clean eraser can be used to erase paint too. This is useful for indelible staining mistakes, but use with caution, as it is probably damaging to archival paper. Paint can be partially lifted or scraped aside in abstract shapes with a hard metal or plastic card. When scraping paint with a credit card or a thin metal shield, little to no paper scratching should occur. Paint can also be pushed aside without diluting saturation if it is maneuvered with a totally dry paintbrush. This is useful for large areas of paint maneuvering. Dry brush or dry-on-dry painting is when dry, highly pigmented paint, neat from the tube or pan, is applied to dry paper. Dry brushing creates amazing textural effects with various brushes, especially on textured watercolor paper like cold press or rough. It deposits thicker paint, so it should be used primarily in top layers unless dissolving the dry brush effect is desired. Dry brush effects can also be achieved with other tools like silicone color blenders, palette knives, dip pen nibs, and natural or synthetic sponges. Each will create its own unique mark. Scumbling, a dancing brush motion with random variegated strokes. It can be done with wet paint, but dry brush shows the most texture. It is typically used to partially cover and soften an underlayer with semi-opaque strokes. Calligraphic dry brush. This is the amazing inking, ruling, outlining, stippling, hatching, and cross-hatching that can be achieved when carefully dry brushing with a rigger, dagger, liner, or spotter brush. Wetter paint can be used, but too thin paint will not hold a strong line. Water-soluble markers. As I've shown in more detail in other videos, water-soluble markers can create runny effects with plenty of character. Use markers with just water or along with watercolor. Once the runny ink has dried, it won't reactivate when water or wet paint is applied over it. Watercolor crayons or pastels. These fun tools can be used just dry, but where's the fun in that? Apply them to paper, then wet them for textured wet color areas, or draw with them on wet paper for a smeary line. Or they can be dissolved on a wet palette and used like old-fashioned watercolor for totally smooth application. Watercolor pencils are the slimmer cousins of watercolor crayons. Best for small thumbnails or adding fine details or lines, they can also be sanded in sprinkles onto a wet water or paint wash for a cool, wet sprinkle effect. Lines can be created in areas where the paper is indented or creased, with a stylus or a palette knife. Whether paint is added before or after indenting, the paint will pool in the teeny, creased canals and result in lines there. Keep in mind that the paper cannot be healed, so any creases are there to stay. Other types of paper damage can also be done deliberately. For example, scratching wet paper with an X-Acto knife causes paint to form raggedy lines there, and erasing over a wet wash causes a blurry, cloudy effect. And while erasing over a dry wash does almost nothing, scratching dry paper with a razor X-Acto reveals sparkly white highlights under the color, perfect for light bouncing off dewdrops or a tumultuous sea. The paper can also be masked from paint application in areas. Masks come in a liquid latex version, which must be allowed to dry before paint application. Or masking tape, artist tape, or clear frisket film can be used with no drying time needed. A wax resist will also repel paint in areas. A candle, a bar of beeswax, or wax crayon must be used. Depending on how much wax is rubbed onto the paper, various degrees of paint resist will be achieved. Remember, wax, like scratching and indenting, cannot be removed from the paper. A gum arabic resist is more forgiving. The gum can be applied, left to dry, and then painted over. Once the paint is dry, the gum arabic can be partially or completely wiped off with a damp brush, sponge, or tissue, revealing the workable paper beneath. Take a look at this gouache or opaque watercolor. It's been on this open palette for half a year, and yet it's still reusable and good as new once it's re-wetted. Gouache can also be used as a resist, and like gum arabic, it is also removable. Apply gouache in resist areas in a thick impasto style. Let dry. Ink or a staining watercolor can be applied to the paper and left to dry. Once the gouache is sponged off, a lovely resist area will be revealed. If watercolor is used instead of ink, expect the color to fade a bit when the gouache is removed. If color fading is not acceptable and watercolor or gouache paint is being used rather than ink, the impasto gouache can be scraped off with a metal card or palette knife instead of being washed off. This results in a patchier, more textured resist area reminiscent of peeling paint, which is what it sort of is. Gouache, like transparent watercolor, has unique qualities all its own and is just as exciting. Gouache can be lifted with a brush like traditional watercolor, but can also be simply corrected or covered up with more gouache in lighter or darker colors. This allows gouache to be painted light to dark, like watercolor, but also dark to light, unlike transparent watercolor. watercolor. Remember how transparent watercolor only needed water to create a graded wash? In this case, gouache needs more work. It requires pre-mixed tones and tints of a color to create gradation. And gouache does not favor blooms and other wet into wet effects like transparent watercolor, but it does allow for repeated seamless blending, whether it's wet, damp, or dry. So how was it watching paint dry? If you enjoyed this, subscribe for more awesome painting videos. Hope you are inspired to use these different techniques and effects in watercolor and gouache. Happy painting!